He wasn't just a fictional character. Hannibal Lecter, a shadow that leapt off the pages and found echoes in the real world. This video takes you deep into the dark and shocking reality that inspired this legendary killer. Are you ready to face the truth that will chill you to the bone? Many of Hannibal Lecter's horrifying traits are purely fictional. For example, his name, Hannibal, rhymes with cannibal, evoking his disturbing desire to consume his victims. This is why he often appears restrained and masked. The film The Silence of the Lambs portrays this well through a story about how he attacked and disfigured a nurse who got too close to him. Lecter's mask has since become a staple of Halloween costumes. Additionally, the name Hannibal also references an ancient god. Harris's novels emphasize his larger-than-life characteristics. For instance, his eyes are described as demonic red. According to producer Brian Fuller in 2013, Mads Mikkelsen's portrayal of Hannibal in the TV series Hannibal was intentionally modeled after nothing less than Lucifer himself. Reportedly, the actor wanted to move away from the more primal approach taken by Hopkins and earlier versions of Lecter, and aimed for a performance that was uniquely his own. The series leans into this idea not just by seductively manipulating Will Graham, but also by making the audience complicit in his crimes, especially as he regularly prepares gourmet five-star meals for his guests using suspicious and unidentified cuts of meat. In the early 1960s, author Thomas Harris was working as a journalist, and one of his assignments took him to Mexico to interview a horrifying murderer named Dykes Askew Simmons. However, it wasn't Simmons who left the biggest impression on Harris while shaping the horror icon. Instead, it was a man named Dr. Salazar, whom Harris initially believed to be a prison staff member. During the interview, Salazar began asking sharp, calculated questions and displayed a calm demeanor that reflected his medical intelligence. Harris was stunned by the depth of his inquiries and the stillness of his body. The ideas he presented about Simmons' victims were chilling. Harris assumed he was speaking with a prison doctor, and Salazar gave him no reason to think otherwise. That is, until Harris asked a guard how long Salazar had worked there, and discovered the truth. Salazar wasn't a prison employee at all. He was in fact an inmate and a former surgeon named Alfredo Bali Trevino. Trevino was also a gay man during a time in Mexican history when LGBTQ individuals were harshly persecuted. According to The Times, UK, Trevino had killed his lover, possibly over money or because the man intended to marry a woman, and had meticulously dismembered his body into dozens of pieces, placing them into an astonishingly small box in a failed attempt to cover up the crime. In addition to that brutal act, he was also suspected of similar murders throughout the 1950s and 1960s, particularly targeting hitchhikers, although none of those crimes were ever conclusively proven. His sentence was commuted after 20 years, and he was released around 1980 or 1981. Trevino returned to his hometown of Monterrey, where he reportedly spent the rest of his life quietly treating elderly and sick patients, often free of charge. He died of pancreatic cancer in 2008. It was November 1934, and nearly 6 years had passed since the disappearance of a 10-year-old girl named Grace Budd. Until that time, police officers had found no significant leads regarding Grace's whereabouts. But everything changed when Delia Flanagan, Grace's mother, received a shocking letter from an anonymous sender. The letter read, "Dear Mrs. Budd, I came to your home on Sunday, June 3rd, 1928. I brought strawberry-flavored cheese and had lunch with you. Grace sat on my lap and kissed me. Right then, I decided to eat her." The strange and chilling letter Mrs. Budd received on that cold November afternoon began with a story about a simple sailor who once discovered that human flesh was delicious and ended with a horrifying description of Grace's murder. Though the confession was unsigned and anonymous, it became the key to ending the horrific crimes of the cannibalistic serial killer Albert Fish. Where the killer's uncontrollable madness and insatiable thirst for blood came from is a terrifying story in itself. Perhaps even more horrifying than the final days of Grace Budd. Hamilton Howard Fish was born on May 19, 1870, to Randall and Ellen Fish in Washington, D.C. He always preferred to be called Albert, the name of his deceased brother. Many believe he chose this name to escape the cruel and mocking nicknames he was given by others, especially children at the orphanage. Regardless, Albert Fish had many names: the Brooklyn Vampire, the Werewolf of Wisteria, and most infamously, the Gray Man. Albert Fish was small, quiet, and unassuming, with a face that, as Russian author Ivan Goncharov put it, could blend easily into a crowd, one you'd forget moments after seeing. But behind that forgettable exterior, he led a private life that would horrify even the most hardened criminals. As a child, Fish, like many of its family members, suffered from severe mental illnesses. His brother was institutionalized, and his uncle had a cyclical form of bipolar disorder. His mother frequently experienced visual hallucinations. When Albert was born, his father, 43 years older than his mother, was already 75. He died when Albert was just 5. Unable to support Albert and his 3 siblings, his widowed mother placed them in an orphanage. It was there that Fish first discovered the pleasure of pain. The orphanage caretakers routinely beat the children and sometimes encouraged them to beat each other. While most of the kids lived in constant fear of punishment, Fish took pleasure in the pain. In 1880, when his mother's mental and financial state improved, she took her children back home. But by then, Albert's spirit was already irreparably damaged. Eventually, Albert Fish's sadomasochistic tendencies evolved into acts of sexual self-harm. He would regularly insert needles into his groin and abdomen. He even crafted a paddle with nails embedded in it to whip himself. In 1890, at age 20, Fish moved to New York, where a new and terrifying chapter of his crimes began. By 1917, Fish could no longer hide the signs of his mental instability, and his wife left him. This event only intensified his self-mutilation. Around this time, he also began experiencing auditory hallucinations. At one point, he wrapped himself in a carpet, claiming that he was following the purification instructions of Saint John the Apostle, one of Christ's 12 disciples. Before fully descending into cannibalism, Fish even involved his own children in his bizarre sadomasochistic games. Before becoming a cannibal, he would often eat raw meat, sometimes inviting his children to join him. Consumed by his dark obsessions, Fish turned to torture and cannibalism. He chose his victims carefully, targeting vulnerable children, especially orphans with mental disabilities or homeless black children, whom he believed no one would notice missing. Fish scanned newspaper classified ads, searching for job-seeking youths or families looking to hire cleaners or servants. In one of those classified pages, he found his next target, Grace Budd. However, Grace was not his original target. Fish's first intended victim was actually Grace's older brother, Edward. Edward Budd had posted a newspaper ad looking for work on a farm. Fish, intrigued, initially planned to lure Edward to a rural house and torture him. Using the alias Frank Howard, he met with Edward and even visited the Budd family at their home in Manhattan, introducing himself as a gentleman farmer, duties in the countryside, and was looking to hire someone. Edward was interested in the offer, but then Fish saw the young girl standing quietly behind her parents. That girl was 10-year-old Grace. At that moment, Fish changed his mind. While still describing the imaginary farm job to the parents, Albert and Delia Budd, he casually mentioned he was in town for his niece's birthday and asked if Grace could accompany him. Shockingly, this gray-haired, seemingly kind stranger convinced them to let Grace go. Fish took Grace, dressed in her best Sunday clothes, to his rural home, the same house where he originally planned to torture Edward. According to the letter Fish later sent to Delia Flanagan, he first stripped naked in an upstairs bedroom to avoid getting blood on his clothes, while Grace picked wildflowers in the yard. Fish then called her inside. The moment she entered and saw the naked old man, she froze in horror. Screaming and crying for help, she was quickly silenced when Fish put his hand over her mouth and dragged her upstairs. Later, Albert Fish sent a terrifying letter to Grace's family. The devastating letter, clearly intended to horrify the Budd family, provided the first real clue that helped police identify the killer. The paper it was written on was from the stationery of the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. Police immediately questioned staff at the company and discovered that a janitor had once left that stationery at a boarding house. At that boarding house, a man named Albert Fish had rented a room. Police noticed he closely resembled Frank Howard, Grace's kidnapper. They questioned him, and to their shock, Fish confessed immediately. In a frenzy, he revealed horrifying details of what he had done to Grace and dozens of other children. Albert Fish confessed to dozens of shocking crimes, each more horrifying than the last. Ultimately, only 3 murders, including Grace's, were definitively proven. Grace Budd's murder was undoubtedly Fish's most gruesome crime. But the other 2 were terrifying as well. Fish is believed to have murdered a 4-year-old boy named Billy Gaffney, who disappeared on February 11, 1927, while playing outside in Brooklyn. After Fish's arrest, a streetcar conductor came forward and identified him as the agitated old man he had seen that day trying to calm a crying boy sitting beside him on the tram. Noticing suspicious looks from others, the man quickly got off at the next stop with the boy. Though Billy's remains were never found, the 3rd victim's body was discovered. A young boy named Francis McDonnell, who vanished in Staten Island in 1924 while playing with his brother and friends. His body was found in a wooded area not long afterward. Shortly before his death, Albert Fish confessed he had lured Francis into the woods and then attacked and strangled him. Albert Fish's trial began on March 11, 1935. It was clear from the evidence that the accused was not of sound mind. Fish's defense lawyer argued that he was insane. Fish himself testified that he heard multiple voices urging him to kill children. Despite several psychiatrists backing his insanity plea, the jury found Fish sane enough to be held responsible. The trial lasted 10 days and ended with a sentence of death by electric chair. In the 1970s, in the quiet, small towns of California, a surface-level calm prevailed. Neighborhoods seemed safe, doors remained unlocked at night, and people still trusted one another. Families ate dinner together, and children played freely in the yards. But beneath this peaceful facade, a dark, invisible force had begun to take shape. Someone who moved silently, slipped through the darkness like a shadow, and gradually turned into a nightmare that shattered the lives of hundreds. It began in Visalia, a modest city in Central California. In 1974, a wave of home burglaries started to sweep through the town. Incidents that, at first glance, seemed relatively insignificant. The burglars stole low-value items, cheap jewelry, family photos, things no seasoned thief would waste time on. Something about this behavior was strange. Obsessive, meticulous, and, most oddly, without any signs of violence. But the police soon realized they were dealing with something far more complex than a local thief. In the stillness of night, this man would break into homes without leaving a trace. The doors were often unlocked. People were too trusting. The ransacker, as he came to be known, would study the houses beforehand, identify escape routes, and plan meticulously. He would often stay in the homes for hours, move objects around, and leave victims with lasting psychological scars, all without ever being seen. Then, in September 1975, the nightmare became horrifyingly real. Claude Snelling, a respected college professor, was woken by a strange noise in his yard. Looking out the window, he saw a man trying to abduct his teenage daughter. He rushed downstairs, opened the door, and, without hesitation, charged at the intruder. But the man had been expecting it. One shot, maybe two, hit Snelling in the chest. He was killed instantly. The killer fled the scene, and that night, Visalia lost a piece of its innocence forever. Snelling's murder caught the attention of the media and law enforcement. What had previously seemed like a series of bizarre burglaries had suddenly turned into a deadly threat. Police deployed more officers, increased surveillance in several neighborhoods, and assigned specialized detectives to the case. But the killer was always a step ahead. In one of the boldest attempts to capture him, a police officer lay in wait inside a house. The ransacker broke in. A confrontation occurred. Shots were fired, but only the intruder's backpack hit the floor. Like a shadow, he vanished into the darkness. Inside the pack, rope, gloves, tape. Tools of a hunter, not an ordinary thief. After that, the Visalia ransacker disappeared. Police believed he might have been killed or arrested, but they were wrong. He was simply planning something bigger. He left, but he didn't forget. And what happened in the next city was more terrifying, more calculated, and far more deadly. 2 years after Claude Snelling's murder, a heavy silence hung over Visalia. Everyone assumed the mysterious intruder was either dead or somehow removed from the scene. But in truth, he was drawing up a new and larger plan. He no longer sought just to scare families. He wanted domination, to institutionalize terror, and to feed on that sense of power. When he reappeared, this time in the suburbs of Sacramento, his methods were more sinister and calculated than ever. He no longer contented himself with theft or harassment. He had become a serial rapist. The first attacks occurred in 1976. In relatively affluent suburban neighborhoods, families reported that an unknown man had broken into their homes at night and raped the women, while tying up and threatening the men. What shocked everyone was the manner of his entry and behavior. He left almost no evidence, silently picked locks, turned off lights, and caught victims by surprise. Often, days before the attack, he would stake out the home, observe movements, inspect escape routes, even cut phone lines or move objects to ensure no one suspected his presence. The number of assaults increased over the months. By the end of 1977, over 30 rapes had been attributed to the so-called East Area Rapist. Police interrogated several suspects and spent tens of thousands of dollars in the investigation. In the winter of 1979, just as Northern California police were still recovering from their failures in the East Area Rapist case, a series of brutal murders began, hundreds of miles away. The first victims were a young couple, Brian and Katie Maggiore. They were attacked just outside their home in Rancho Cordova. The sound of gunshots woke the neighborhood. When police arrived, they found both bodies near the sidewalk. The man had been shot in the head. The woman killed a few meters away while fleeing. Nothing was stolen. The sole purpose, it seemed, was to kill, simply, swiftly, and without emotion. At first, these murders weren't linked to the previous rapes. But gradually, similarities emerged: the presence of ropes, knife marks, signs of forced entry, and most notably, a pattern among the victims: homes in semi-rural areas, unguarded windows, and couples who never imagined they could be targets. Southern California police were baffled. The victims had no connection to one another. Some were elderly, others newlyweds. But the psychological pattern of the perpetrator was becoming clear. He was obsessed with power. He craved being inside someone else's home, controlling the environment, rendering the victim completely submissive, and then cementing that dominance through murder. The media called him the original Night Stalker, a silent prowler who slipped into homes like a ghost and left them soaked in the scent of blood and fear. People no longer felt safe, not just at night, but even during the day. Some families even abandoned their homes. Cities entered a state of semi-militarization. Windows were barred with iron. Dogs and cameras were everywhere. Yet the ruthless killer struck again, and each time with greater precision. But in 1986, right after the murder of an 18-year-old girl named Janelle Cruz, everything suddenly stopped. No similar attacks were ever reported again. The killer vanished. No arrest, no death. Just silence. But if we think it was truly over, we're mistaken. He was still alive, just withdrawn from the shadows. It was merely a hunter's hibernation. Years passed. People in California tried to erase the terrifying memory of the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker. Homes that were once crime scenes were sold. Streets once walked in fear were now full of children and new families. But the survivors never forgot. Those who lived through it carried the memories of dark nights and the threatening stare of a masked man. In the 1990s, advances in forensic science began to emerge. DNA had become a key tool in solving complex cases. Investigators had preserved samples from old crime scenes, hoping that one day science would give them a voice. With the start of the 21st century, DNA analysis made a huge leap forward. And it was here that the story entered a new chapter. Police decided to revisit a case that had grown into a dark legend. Tissue samples, fluids, and strands of hair from the old crimes were extracted and entered into modern systems. At first, there was little hope. Existing databases only contained DNA from registered criminals, and the killer had never been caught. But in 2017, forensic researchers proposed a revolutionary idea. If the killer himself wasn't in the database, maybe a relative was. A cousin, a niece, even a second cousin once removed. So the police uploaded the killer's DNA to public genetic databases, websites like GED Match, where millions of people had uploaded their DNA to trace their ancestry and family roots. Now, those same platforms became tools to hunt a murderer who had eluded justice for decades. And the result was astonishing. Within weeks, genetic algorithms identified traces of a particular family. Further investigation, genealogical mapping, and cross-checking dates and locations narrowed the search. Eventually, a name surfaced: Joseph James DeAngelo, a 72-year-old man, retired, living in a quiet area. A kind father and grandfather, or so he seemed. But his past told another story. DeAngelo had once been a police officer, someone highly skilled in interrogation, investigation, and evading detection. Without public announcement, the police placed him under surveillance. For days, they tracked his movements. At the right moment, they retrieved a cup he had discarded after drinking. DNA remained on the rim. It was compared to the samples from the crimes, and the result was lightning in the dark. A perfect match. The Golden State Killer had been identified. In April 2018, Joseph DeAngelo was quietly arrested. His neighbors were stunned. A man who had always seemed polite, tidy, and quiet was now being led away in handcuffs. When the news of his arrest broke, a wave of emotions swept across the state. Survivors wept. Families who had lost loved ones for the first time felt that justice might finally be served. In 2020, after extensive negotiations, DeAngelo confessed to 13 murders and more than 50 rapes. In a tense courtroom, one by one, victims stood and told their stories, voices shaking with rage. They were no longer afraid. He was now just an old man, sitting in a wheelchair, calm, still, showing none of the monstrous presence that once cast a shadow over so many homes. But the truth was, that monster had always been with them, with wounds that never bled, but devoured lives. When the judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without parole, a deep sigh echoed through the courtroom. Not a sigh for forgiveness, nor for forgetting, but for the end of a long-awaited reckoning.